Thank you, and welcome to another edition of Ask Neurowork, the podcast where we answer your tough questions about neurodiversity in the workplace. I'm your host, Rachel Worsley, founder of Neurodiversity Media, and my co-host is Kate Hardiman, the CEO of Unify 360. And today we're here to answer the tough question here, which is, what are the elements of a best practice neurodiversity policy at a HR level? Now, this is an interesting question, and I'm going to throw it straight to Kate, who's done a lot of research on this question about what exactly are these best elements. So fire away, Kate. What are they?
I have, Rach. I've gone down a rabbit hole on this one because every organisation out there should be looking to incorporate neurodiversity into their policy suite right now, whether that's in the form of a standalone neurodiversity specific policy, as some organisations have, or incorporating neurodiversity into their DEI policy or whatever the organisation's equivalent is. So I reviewed a few good examples of neurodiversity policies to find out what makes them best practice. And I found 7 different elements of what I thought made up really good neurodiversity policies. So the first element is that any good neurodiversity policy starts with a clear statement about the organisation's commitment to inclusion and acceptance. So they have things we call explicit inclusion statements. And these statements are really there to affirm the company's commitment to supporting diverse neurological conditions as a key element of its diversity and inclusion strategy. And they also include statements related to respect and dignity. And what those statements do is they call for all employees, regardless of neurodiversity, to be treated with respect and have their contributions valued. The second element is that they talk to how the organisation is providing reasonable accommodations or adjustments. So effective accommodations are the resources and allowances that NDs might need to be able to perform their job at their best. So these things are like individual assessments of need. So each request from an NDer for an accommodation should be considered on a case-by-case basis and needs to involve the neurodivergent person in the discussion to make sure that their needs are met effectively. And also they mentioned flexible solutions. So accommodations might include things like flexible work hours, remote work options, specialist equipment and software, or even just changes in how communication takes place with the staff member. The third element I found was that the policy outlines how the organisation is actively building sensitivity and awareness of neurodiversity across the business. So awareness training can really help improve team dynamics and lift productivity. So things like holding regular workshops and presentations that educate employees across the business about neurodiversity and how to create a more inclusive environment in general. And then we look at specific training for managers and leaders on how to support neurodivergent staff effectively. So that might include how they can adapt their leadership and communication styles to work best with their neurodivergent team members. Fourth common element I found across the policies I looked at was a good and effective communication channels. So because truly inclusive leaders are able to adapt their communication style to suit different needs of their staff, and by that I mean might be finding out if your staff member needs or prefers written instructions because they might tend to struggle with verbal instructions, and making sure that feedback is given in a way that's constructive and supportive and in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary stress, because that can happen often unbeknownst to the leader or the manager. So these policies are differentiating between sort of broad across business awareness training for all staff and then looking at specific training for leaders and managers, which covers a different sort of set of information, if you like. The fifth common element across the policies that I liked was that they acknowledge the need to promote career development for all employees, including neurodivergent employees. So that could take the form of what they're calling individualized career plans. So those plans look at identifying the unique strengths and the goals of neurodivergent employees. So you might have someone in the team with autism who's got particular strengths in things like might be data analysis or pattern recognition. So how are you, as the manager, working with that person to craft a job role that lets them play to those strengths? And looking at other support systems like mentorship and peer support programs to help NDers navigate their career development. The sixth common inclusion in a good neurodiversity policy I found is about the importance of confidentiality and privacy. It's really important that employees feel safe disclosing their neurodivergent status. So policies should mention clear guidelines on how sensitive information is handled and who has access to it. And then you want to ensure that disclosure, so when a neurodivergent person tells an employer that they're neurodivergent, that's always voluntary and it's really handled with absolute respect and sensitivity. And the last element I found that was crossing over these policies was the mention of how they're going to provide ongoing support. So make sure that your policy talks to any mechanisms that you've set up in the business to help NDers on an ongoing basis. So things like, have you organised internal support groups? Often these are called employee resource groups or ERGs. And any other ways that you're helping NDers connect with maybe external neurodiversity networks, for example. And lastly, for managers to set up regular check-ins to discuss any workplace challenges with their NDer and work out solutions together. That's what I found, Rach. A lot of content.
Yeah, well, that's a very good summary of what the rabbit hole that you've gone through, I suppose, to dig out all of those different policies and stuff. Before I go into my question, I'm curious to know, are you willing to name any companies who got those really great policies that you referred to?
I won't name specific companies, but I can say they were a mix of both international and Australian. I found many more policies in the US and the UK. Australia was a little bit behind, but I did find a couple of universities and a couple of healthcare organisations. But what I might do is I might reach out to see if a couple of those sort of Australian-based organisations might be happy for me to reference a link, and we can put that into the show notes of the podcast.
That will be excellent. No, thank you for letting us know about the diversity of policies that are out there and also the quality of those policies.
Yeah, there's a huge range.
I can imagine. But so thank you for doing that really important research. That's really good. I guess for me, answering this question, I'll speak from the perspective as a neurodivergent person myself, as an autistic and ADHD person myself, about these policies and what could this actually mean on a practical level. I suppose, you've touched on those 7 things, and respect and dignity, as you mentioned, as part of the first point you mentioned on inclusion statements, is really important. And that has to be established in the ground level with the culture that you're trying to build in that organization. So a psychologically safe workplace is key for people who are neurodivergent to feel safe and being able to feel like they can speak out if they notice something isn't right with certain processes and or to raise issues if they think there's ways that could be done, things that can be done better in the company, those kind of things that will be available with other employees. But for neurodivergent people who have been traditionally so disadvantaged and not being heard, having a neurodiversity policy that's kind of states, that we respect and that we acknowledge these contributions is an important starting point. But they're just words on a page to start off with. So it's not enough to just have words on a page. We have to back it up with action. So really drilling down into, as you mentioned, in the different points you raised, reasonable accommodations is kind of really setting out a reasonable accommodations policy, I suppose. That could be a policy in itself, as part of the neurodiversity policy. We probably don't want to have too many policies, but that could be one of them in terms of a process for reasonable accommodation. So how does that work practically on the ground level? Well, for example, it's about making it very clear to your neurodivergent or non-neurodivergent employees that, accommodations are available. And this is the process of trying to request for them, such as have a chat with your manager about the things that you think you need to help you succeed at work, and then basically how can we sit down with you to help you succeed. So a company that has an attitude of how can we best help you succeed, regardless of who you are, but especially if you're neurodivergent, you've kind of traditionally never got that sort of explicit recognition. That can be really handy to have that highlighted in a neurodiversity policy, especially around the reasonable accommodations kind of area. I
Yeah,
suppose. Yeah, go for
so-
it, Kate.
sorry, Rach. I thought it might be worth mentioning one of the policies I saw. I thought was exceptional around accommodations. They actually mentioned that they'd set up a hub on their intranet full of links to a self-service support, a resource library, if you like. So any employee, be they neurodivergent or not, be they disclosed or not, could go to this hub and look through all of the different types of accommodations and supports in the form of software and apps, for example. So there might be things like software that they could download as an extension onto their individual computers, and that might help them. It might be a word processing related app or a piece of software. So it might help them process the document more easily, because for a lot of people who say have dyslexia, the words on the page jump around a lot, and this particular software helps with that. So what I loved was that it was an anonymous resource pool that anyone could access. And a lot of these tools aren't just great for people who are neurodivergent, great for any employee. So this idea that it wasn't about you have to disclose before you can access the resources you need. Here's just a whole range of things that you can pick and flick, and you can empower yourself to find and trial what works for you, which I thought was really a great aspect of this particular policy.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Kate. Thank you for sharing that, because yeah, it really goes back down to even the term neurodiversity. Like, it's supposed to be a very inclusive term that includes neurotypical people and neurodivergent people alike, I suppose. But
Mhm.
obviously we place a huge emphasis on neurodivergent people's kind of access to accommodations and resources, and that's really important. But as you said, it's really important that all this is available to everyone as well, because everyone can benefit from those accommodations, sort of the rising tide lifts all boats kind of
Yeah.
analogy, I suppose, in that way. Um, yeah, I guess I'll only add to the point that you mentioned around career development and providing ongoing support. I think that's, having that specifically spelled out in a policy can be really helpful for neurodivergent people joining an organization for the first time to understand, how they can progress up the ladder, but also to recognize that career development doesn't mean being promoted to being a people manager if that's not really your thing. If you're someone who really loves digging down on the skill set that they have and being a specialist in that area, then that career development should be something that should be encouraged and not discouraged as part of career development. So having a flexible sort of perspective on career development is probably a very important part of neurodiversity policy. Because I think when I think about it, really with a neurodiversity policy, it should really just be universal good practice, good working practice policy, really, because it acknowledges all the different kinds of minds, all the different conditions that we may have that we bring to the workplace, and celebrating those strengths as well. And then if there are challenges, we just find ways to work through them and, and be able to adapt to them and that sort of thing. So I think what you've mentioned, Kate, and kind of your summary of what a great HR policy can include is really, really helpful. And hopefully my thoughts on how this could, work on a practical level can also be helpful as well. Any final thoughts?
Just to say, I think a really well-developed neurodiversity policy says a lot about the organisation's ongoing commitment to creating a workplace that is showing that it's actively supporting and benefits from diverse talent of all employees, including those who are neurodivergent, because these policies really do improve. They shift the needle in the work environment for NDEs, and ultimately they're going to enhance the overall productivity and creativity of the whole workforce. So my message to our listeners is that if you or your organisation doesn't have one yet, put it on the agenda, because it's a really important element of an inclusive culture.
Perfect. Perfect. So we'll leave it there. So thanks, Kate, for joining the conversation today.
You're welcome, Rach.